When you think about the great empires of India, your mind probably goes to these huge land-based powers, right? But way back in the late 15th century, a tiny European nation showed up by sea and completely changed the rules of the game. This is the story of the Portuguese in India, and it's really the beginning of a whole new kind of power that would shape the next few centuries of global history.
And that really brings us to the big question we're tackling today. How on earth did Portugal, this little country on the very edge of Europe, manage to build and control a massive empire from the sea, halfway across the world? Well, the answer is a fascinating mix of greed, God, and a totally revolutionary way of thinking about power.
All right, so here's how we're going to break down this incredible story. First, we'll look at the desperate hunt for a sea route to India. Then we'll see what happened when they arrived and things got messy. After that, we'll meet the masterminds who actually built the empire, see how they ran the whole operation, and finally, figure out why it all fell apart and what they left behind. Okay, let's start with that quest. Because to really get why the Portuguese were so obsessed with finding a way to India, we need to rewind the clock to one single game-changing event in the middle of the 15th century. So imagine this. The year is 1453, and Constantinople falls. Now, this wasn't just some distant battle. For Europe, it was an economic catastrophe. All the traditional land routes for trade, the ones that brought all the good stuff like spices and silks from the east, were suddenly slammed shut, controlled by powers that were not exactly friendly to Christian Europe. So what happens next? Well, the middlemen, mostly Arab merchants, suddenly have a total stranglehold on all trade. The price of things like pepper and cinnamon just skyrocketed. The whole system became a giant state-run monopoly. For the nations of Europe, finding a direct sea route to India wasn't just a fun adventure anymore. It was a matter of pure economic survival. And what was driving them? Well, it was this powerful 1-2 punch of motives. You had figures like Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator, and for him, the mission was clear. First, find a way around the Muslim-controlled trade routes to get to the riches of the East, and second, spread the Christian faith while you're at it. It was a mission for both gold and God. And once they set their minds to it, things started happening fast. First, in 1487, a guy named Bartholomew Diaz makes a huge breakthrough. He proves you can actually sail around the southern tip of Africa. Suddenly, a sea route was possible. A few years later, the Pope brokers the Treaty of Tordesillas, which basically splits the undiscovered world between Spain and Portugal, giving Portugal the green light for the East. And then, the big one. In May 1498, with the help of a local pilot named Abdul Majid, Vasco da Gama's little fleet finally reaches Calicut in India. After decades of trying, they had done, so they've arrived. But here's where the story takes a really sharp turn. You see, the Portuguese didn't just show up to trade peacefully. Oh no, they came to dominate. And the switch from friendly merchant to armed conqueror happened shockingly fast. On that first trip, Vasco da Gama actually got a pretty friendly welcome from the local Hindu ruler, the Zamorin. But you can imagine, the Arab traders who were already there, they weren't exactly thrilled to see the competition. Just 2 years later, the next Portuguese expedition, led by Pedro Cabral, gets into a fight over a trading post. And Cabral's response? It was absolutely brutal. He bombarded the city of Calicut from his ships. The message was loud and clear. Peaceful trade was officially over. When Vasco da Gama himself came back in 1501, he wasn't playing around anymore. The sources say he came with ferocious hostility. His new goal wasn't just to trade, it was to completely shatter the Arab trade network. He started attacking their ships everywhere, using his superior cannons to force local rulers into letting him build fortified bases. The strategy was simple, and it was brutal. Take the entire spice trade by force. Okay, so you can't just go around blowing things up forever, right? You need a plan. You need architects to turn all that violence into a real, lasting empire. And this is where two very important guys, the first Portuguese governors, step onto the stage. They're the ones who really built the Estado de India, or the Portuguese state in India. The first governor, Francisco de Almeida, had this really smart idea he called the Blue Water Policy. His thinking was, why bother trying to conquer all this land? As long as we are the absolute masters of the sea, we control everything. So instead of building a land empire, he focused on total naval domination, forcing every other ship to buy a Portuguese permit, a cartaz, just for the right to sail. It was basically a protection rocket on the high seas. But it was the guy who came after him, Afonso de Albuquerque, who is known as the real founder of the Portuguese Empire in the East. See, Albuquerque understood that a powerful navy is great, But a navy needs a home base. It needs to be anchored to strategic spots on land. And his plan was nothing short of brilliant. He went after the key maritime choke points of the whole region, places like Hormuz and Malacca. By controlling them, he basically put a lock on the entire Indian Ocean. Then, in 1510, he captured Goa, which was a huge deal. It became the very first piece of Indian soil to be ruled by a European power. But he didn't stop at conquest. He made some radical social changes too. He banned the practice of sati in his territory and even encouraged his men to marry local women to create a loyal local population. Later on, another governor, Nuno da Cunha, would make Goa the official capital and grab even more territories, cementing their hold. So, they've got the sea lanes, they've got their key territories, but how did they actually run this sprawling maritime state? Let's pop the hood and take a look at the machinery of their empire. The administration they set up was actually pretty lean and mean. At the very top, you had the viceroy, the big boss, who served for 3 years. Right under him was the Vidor da Fazenda. Think of him as the chief financial officer, in charge of all the money in the ships. And then out on the ground, you had captains running the various fortresses, helped by traders they called factors. Now, this is where things get really complicated, because their religious policy was a total contradiction. On one hand, they were fiercely intolerant, especially of Muslims. They later brought the brutal Inquisition to Goa, which also targeted Hindus. But then, get this, at the very same time, they were sending their smartest Jesuit missionaries to have friendly theological debates at the court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar. It's this wild mix of extreme persecution and clever diplomacy. But as we all know, no empire lasts forever. And this empire, which was built on sea power and aggression, was no different. The very thing that made the Portuguese so powerful, the sea, would also be the path their rivals used to come for them. And this timeline just shows you how fast it all happened. For about 100 years, they were the undisputed kings of the Indian Ocean. But as soon as the 1600s rolled around, you start to see the cracks. First, the Dutch kick them out of the super profitable Spice Islands. Then, a new player, the English, shows up and hands them a stunning naval defeat. By 1663, it's pretty much game over when the Dutch seize all their forts on the Malabar coast. The decline was just incredibly swift. So why did it all fall apart so quickly? Well, it was like a perfect storm. Powerful Indian empires like the Marathas started pushing back on land. Their own aggressive policies and religious intolerance made them a ton of enemies, including the mighty Mughals. At the same time, Portugal itself got distracted by a shiny new object, Brazil. And while they were looking the other way, in sailed their bigger, richer, and more ruthless European rivals, the Dutch and the English. But to really get their importance, you have to look at these ships. These Portuguese carracks weren't just boats. They were floating fortresses. They represented a fundamental change in how power worked in this part of the world. For the first time ever, the main struggle wasn't for land, it was for control of the sea. And that's their real legacy. They literally wrote the playbook for European colonialism, used superior naval tech to create a trade monopoly by force. They brought new military innovations, like putting heavy cannons on ships and organizing infantry in new ways. And of course, their cultural and religious fingerprint is still visible in parts of India to this very day. So we end up with this complicated picture. On one hand, the Portuguese were incredible innovators, masters of the sea who connected the world in a new way. But on the other hand, that legacy is forever stained by the cruelty and intolerance they used to build it. It leaves you wondering, how do you weigh the pioneer against the persecutor? It's something to think about.